Hello, so welcome to part 8 of Toxin Sequestration Theory, or TST. This is my new theory of cancer, and it's a very big departure from the mainstream theory. As you know, the mainstream theory says that cancer is genetic and cancer is selfish. I've completely reversed that and said that cancer is not genetic and it's not selfish either. And the new theory of cancer builds on the work of MIT professor Stephanie Seneff. She was the one who first formulated this idea for deuterium, and I extended it to a whole host of other toxins. The basic idea is that cancer tumors sequester, store, and process toxins. That is their job. It is their role as a secondary detox organ. The body builds cancer tumors to be detox organs. In other words, to sequester toxins and pull them away from the healthy tissue in order to protect the healthy tissue from toxicity. And in other words, this implies that cancer itself is not a disease, rather it is a symptom of toxic overload, and toxic overload is the true disease. Now, just to clarify, there are other chronic diseases, things like autism, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis. Those are real diseases and they have real tissue damage happening. But cancer itself, I'm arguing, is actually not a disease. It's a defense mechanism. So it is something that the body does on purpose. And increasingly, there's a lot of these diseases that are actually defense mechanisms. I've talked about cancer tumors, cachexia, metastasis, insulin resistance. These are things that the body is doing on purpose to protect itself from toxicity. So I think we're getting a deeper appreciation for chronic disease and how it actually works, as well as things that actually aren't diseases. And in this video, I want to talk about a specific type of cancer, blood cancer or leukemia. And I've previously talked about other types of tissue-specific cancers. I've talked about prostate cancer, breast cancer, liver cancer, pancreatic cancer, lung cancer, some of the common cancers. And it's interesting because mainstream medicine doesn't really have a good explanation for why cancers occur in specific organs, but our theory does. And in fact, we've talked about what I call tissue-specific toxin sequestration theory, which says that the body chooses organs for specific reasons. It's strategic. It's not random. Mainstream medicine just says, "Oh, everything's random. You get a mutation here. That's where you get your tumor, right?" So, if that was true, then you would expect heart cancer to happen, and heart cancer pretty much almost never happens because chances are you might get a mutation in your heart cell. But heart cancer is extremely rare, and we can explain that by the fact that the body is not going to build a tumor in a place where it would cause immediate death, right? If you had a tumor growing on your heart couldn't pump blood correctly. And so our theory explains that, right? Similarly, prostate cancer, why is that so freaking common? Our theory explains that prostate cancer is common because the body decides to use the prostate as a seed oil storage device. Prostate tissue is really good at pulling in and storing seed oils. And so if you have prostate cancer, then chances are you might be consuming too much excess seed oils because the body chooses the prostate as a seed oil storage device, basically. And similarly, in the case of breast cancer is really good at sequestering excess estrogen. So if you have excess estrogen in your body, you might end up with, say, breast cancer, which would just be because your body chooses breast tissue to store estrogen and process it as well. So the point is that certain toxins get mapped to certain tissues, right? Estrogen gets mapped to breast, and seed oils get mapped to the prostate, and glucose and fructose get mapped to the pancreas. So we have this interesting mapping between certain toxins and certain types of cancers. And today, I'm going to add one more to the list, and that's for the case of blood cancer, which is closely connected to the bone marrow, by the way. That the specific toxin that's connected to that is benzene. Benzene is an industrial chemical, it's an industrial solvent. It's found in a lot of industrial products. Most notably, it's found in gasoline. So when you fill up the car, with gasoline, you're getting exposed to some fumes. You're breathing in some toxic chemicals. Some of those are benzene, unfortunately. And so it is volatile, which means you can breathe it in through your lungs. And you can also breathe it in through cigarette smoke. Benzene is found in cigarette smoke. It's also found in car exhaust, as you can imagine, because it's found in gasoline, so it's found in car exhaust. And and then it's also in some furnitures, like whenever furniture is off gassing, you can breathe in the benzene from the furniture. So there's various ways that you can get exposed to benzene. But what's fascinating is that benzene has like a direct connection to blood cancer. It happens to be the chemical that is most well established to being a cause of blood cancer. Things like leukemia, for example. And, we can get into why that is. It's actually very interesting. Why is it that benzene would lead to blood cancer? Like, we established that, seed oils lead to prostate cancer because the prostate is really good at, pulling in seed oils. And estrogen leads to breast cancer because breast tissue is really good at pulling in and processing estrogen. So what is it about the blood that works so well with the benzene toxin? And that's really interesting. And before I get into that, I will mention that benzene is a toxin. It does damage the body's tissues, and it does that by creating reactive oxygen species, ROS, which are tissue damaging chemicals. Basically, they're at the center of chronic disease. So in my theory, all chronic disease is caused by ROS. And benzene is yet another chemical that creates ROS. And so in my theory, any chemical that creates ROS should be a carcinogen. It should be something that cancer cells try to sequester and store or process. Okay, so let's try to understand why it is that benzene specifically leads to blood cancer. Now, benzene is a molecule that is really hard for the body to store. It's really hard for the body to sequester because it's a small molecule. It's just basically a single ring of 6 carbons, and it kind of like diffuses rapidly throughout the bloodstream. It's what they call a diffuse toxin. It's kind of hard to nail down. And there's not many tissues in the body that are good at pulling it in and sequestering it. The body doesn't really have a good way to pull in this benzene, unlike other chemicals, unlike estrogen or seed oils or iron. It doesn't really have good ways to kind of pull it into tissues and sequester it and keep it in behind closed doors. And whenever you do get benzene into your body, it kind of just spreads throughout your whole bloodstream, just spreads throughout all your bloodstream. It's really hard to nail down. It's what they call a diffuse toxin. And, because it is a diffuse toxin, then that means that if you do get some of it in your body, like I said, it just spreads throughout your whole bloodstream. And so the body's kind of throws its hands up in the air and it's like, well, this toxin is really hard to chase down. So the best that I can do is kind of just isolate it to the blood, right? And it doesn't try to, isolate it in the liver or the pancreas or the prostate because it can't really do that. And so instead it says, well, let me try to isolate it to the blood. And you might say, well, but what's the strategy in that? Because so many vital organs are exposed to the blood. Like the heart is exposed to the blood, the vascular endothelium, the lining of the arteries, that's exposed to the blood, and the brain as well. So there's the concern that if you try to isolate a chemical to the blood, it might destroy your vital organs. And that's where the bone marrow comes in. Because really it's not necessarily just a a blood cancer, it's really a bone marrow cancer, because what happens is that the bone marrow steps up to the plate and says, okay, I'm going to try to sequester the benzene in order to help out the heart and the vascular endothelium and other tissues as well. So the bone marrow is highly vascularized, which means that it has tons of little tiny blood vessels that go through it. It's like a little maze. So just imagine that the bone marrow is kind of like a massive maze of blood vessels. And so the benzene can kind of get lost in the bone marrow maze, right? And that's the body's strategy. So the body's strategy is like, well, benzene spreads throughout the whole bloodstream, but if we can just kind of get it lost in the bone marrow, then that can kind of sequester it away from the other key tissues like the heart or the major arteries, right? And so that's the key strategy, is that the body chooses the bone marrow to sequester and store benzene. And it just so happens that the bone marrow is full of blood vessels, right? And those blood vessels are the blood vessels that the body chooses to store benzene in, right? So in other words, it chooses a subset of blood vessels, so not all blood vessels, right? Some, the key blood vessels, the ones that are, closely connected to the heart, those ones the body wants to protect. But the blood vessels in the bone marrow are the ones that it shoves the benzene in. So it's like, okay, benzene, you go into the blood vessels that are in the bone marrow and you stay there, okay, stay put. And so bone cancer, bone marrow cancer, which is leukemia, this fits in very well with toxin sequestration theory. It is a sequestration. The benzene is getting sequestered into the bone marrow, which prevents it from damaging the other vital organs, the heart and other things. So yeah, I find that really interesting, and it fits well into our theory. And what was interesting about that is it's actually a liquid tumor. It's not actually a solid tumor, because the benzene is still in the bloodstream. It's still in the liquid. But it just so happens that liquid is inside the bone marrow. So it's a new kind of tumor that I haven't talked about before. And I think that, like I said, I've talked about things like breast cancer, prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer, etc. But this is the first liquid tumor that I've discussed. But nevertheless, you can imagine it as a sequestration process. And so let's see, what else can we do? So how would you basically, prevent this kind of thing from happening? Well, naturally, you would try to prevent your exposure to benzene, right? You would try to reduce exposure to gasoline fumes, right? Don't breathe that stuff in. Reduce exposure to car exhaust fumes. Reduce exposure to cigarette smoke. And, like I said, also, it can be in contaminated drinking water, so filter your drinking water, because benzene can be in that stuff too. And stay away from big manufacturing plants, because those manufacturing plants oftentimes use benzene. So it's a classic industrial toxin, benzene is, right? So basically stay away from industrial things. And so, and also the nice thing is that it fits in well to our toxin to organ mapping. So if you know someone who does have blood cancer or something like leukemia, then, just give them a heads up, like, hey, look, do you ever have any exposure to benzene in your life? And, try to reduce that. Because that is the number one chemical associated with blood cancer. So it's sort of very interesting that we have that direct toxin to organ mapping. And also you can think about the terminology when people talk about, benign blood cancer versus malignant blood cancer. Needless to say, I'm not a huge fan of those terms, because I find them misleading. But nevertheless, in the context of blood cancer, it would be a benign version of the blood cancer would be where the toxic load is not so overwhelming that the body's lost control of it. Whereas in the malignant case, basically the toxic burden is widespread. You have lots of benzene exposure, and maybe you also have declining detox capability where your liver is failing or your kidneys failing or whatever, your detox organs aren't doing well. So really, difference between benign or malignant blood cancer would just be how widespread the toxicity is, and also how good your body's detox capabilities are at the current moment. So I think that kind of wraps up my discussion of benzene and blood cancer. I think it's very interesting. Like I said, I think it fits well with our toxin sequestration theory because, like I said, it is getting sequestered. It's getting sequestered into the bone marrow. And that does protect the vital organs. It protects the heart. It protects the major arteries. So it fits well into our theory. Also, I just wanted to point out that I did a interview with the Terrain Theory podcast, and I'll try to link to the video for that Terrain Theory podcast so that you guys can watch it and check it out. Thanks very much for listening, and let me know your thoughts.